The dreadnought didn't slow down. It couldn't. But now, it wasn't moving as one ship anymore. It was moving like a thought that had started forgetting itself halfway through. On the tactical screen, the enemy fleet was no longer clean. Blue flashes were still appearing, but they were scattered now. Uneven. Unstable. Some ships arrived too early. Some too late. And some appeared for a fraction of a second, then snapped out of existence like they never agreed to be there. Nat stared at the display. "It's collapsing," she said quietly. John didn't take his eyes off the screen. "Not collapsing," he corrected. "Splitting." The dreadnought fired again. But this time, the human fleets didn't just react. They anticipated the instability itself. Missile waves were launched not at ships, but at where the ships would fail to exist correctly. And it worked. Explosions didn't hit armor. They hit misalignment in time. Entire enemy formations flickered as reality failed to keep their position stable. Nat's voice tightened. "They're losing coherence." John nodded. "Temporal overload," he said. "They pushed too far ahead of their own timeline." The bridge shook as another wave of gravity distortion passed through the system. But something was different now. The pressure wasn't just from the enemy. It was from both sides collapsing the same system in opposite directions. Nat looked at John. "If this keeps going," she said, "the whole battlefield will destabilize." John finally turned slightly. "That's already happening." On the screen, Pluto Station's debris field shimmered. Not exploding. Not moving. Repeating. Like fragments of battle were stuck replaying themselves in slightly different positions. Time was no longer consistent. It was overlapping. The dreadnought fired again, but half the volley vanished mid-flight. Not destroyed. Not dodged. Just unregistered by reality. Nat whispered, "They can't hold their phase anymore." John nodded slowly. "They're running out of synchronization." A new alert flashed. Enemy temporal grid failure. Multiple desync events. Then another. Causality drift detected. Then another. Warning. Local timeframe instability. Nat stepped back slightly. "This isn't just a battle anymore," she said. John answered quietly. "No." He looked at the screen. "This is correction collapsing into chaos." Outside, the dreadnought finally changed behavior. It stopped firing for a full 3 seconds. That was the longest pause since the battle began. Then it fired again. But instead of attacking fleets, it fired backward. Net blinks. "What?" John's eyes narrowed. "They're trying to rewind their own engagement window." The tactical display went insane. Ships began appearing in positions they had already been destroyed in. Others vanished and reappeared elsewhere, damaged or repaired inconsistently. Nat grabbed the console edge. "They're undoing their own timeline locally," she said. John nodded once. "Desperation move." A deep vibration passed through the entire system. Not explosion. Not impact. Something worse. A temporal snap. For a split second, every screen went white. Then returned. But the battlefield had changed. The dreadnought was still there. But now it was surrounded by overlapping versions of itself. Some intact. Some broken. Some already dead. Nat's voice dropped. "They've fractured completely." John studied it carefully. "No," he said slowly. Then corrected himself. "Not completely." He pointed at the center version of the dreadnought. "That one is still stable." Nat followed his gaze. And realized the truth. Only one version remained coherent enough to continue the fight. The rest were echoes of failed timeline attempts. John's voice was steady. "If we hit the stable one," he said, "the rest collapse." Nat nodded. "But it's still predicting us." John looked at the firing solutions. Then at the instability data. Then at the overlapping timelines. And finally, he said, "Not if we stop fighting forward." Nat frowned. "What does that mean now?" John's fingers hovered over the console. Then he gave the order. "All remaining fleets, shift firing delay by 0.1 seconds." Netzert. "That puts us out of sync with them," she said. John nodded. "Exactly." A pause. Then she understood. We stopped being predictable. Yes. Outside, human fleets adjusted. Slowly. Carefully. Not faster. Not stronger. Just out of phase with expectation. The dreadnought fired again. And for the first time, the human fleet didn't arrive where it expected. It arrived after the prediction window closed. Missiles hit clean. Railguns tore through weakened temporal overlaps. Energy weapons struck the stable dreadnought directly. The central version shuddered. Nat whispered, "It's working." John watched carefully, but his expression didn't relax. Because he saw it too. The stable dreadnought was still calculating. Still adapting. Still trying to anchor itself to a timeline that was now slipping away. And then, it made one final move. The dreadnought stopped firing outward. And instead, focused everything inward. Oh no. John understood instantly. They're collapsing their own phase to escape detection. A bright blue flash erupted across the battlefield. Louder than before. Brighter. Stronger. But unstable. Too unstable. The dreadnought didn't disappear cleanly. It fractured. Split. Shattered across multiple timelines at once. And then, silence. The battlefield didn't explode. It emptied. No enemy ships remained in stable existence. Only fragments of energy and broken echoes of movement. Net slowly exhaled. "It's over," she said. John didn't answer immediately. He kept staring at the empty space where the dreadnought had been. Then he said quietly, "No." Nat turned to him. "What do you mean no?" John's voice was calm, but sharp. "We didn't destroy them." A pause. "We forced them to stop agreeing on reality." Silence filled the bridge. Then Nat whispered, "So they erased themselves." John nodded once. From this timeline, yes. A long quiet followed. Then alarms slowly faded. Systems stabilized. The blue flashes were gone. For now. Nat leaned back slightly. "So what now?" she asked. John looked at the starfield ahead. Toward Earth. Still vulnerable. Still waiting. And said the only thing that mattered now. We make sure they never find the right version of time again. The silence didn't last long. It never did in this war. A new wave of blue flashes appeared across the tactical screen. But this time, something felt wrong in a different way. Nat squinted at the data. "They changed something," she said. John was already watching. "Yes," he replied quietly. "They adapted again." The dreadnought wasn't just firing anymore. It was waiting. Waiting for human responses. Waiting for commands. Waiting for intent. Then reacting before that intent became action. Nat's voice tightened. "They're not predicting our moves anymore." John finished it. "They're predicting our decisions." A heavy silence dropped over the bridge. That was worse. A lot worse. Because decisions weren't physical. They were thought. And if the enemy could reach that layer, then there was nowhere left to hide. The tactical display flickered again. Human fleets attempted coordinated strikes. But every formation collapsed before execution. Ships drifted into positions they never intended to take. Weapons fired into empty space that had just been occupied. "Net grittet hertil." "This isn't combat anymore," she said. "It's correction. Like they're fixing mistakes before we make them." John watched carefully. Then he noticed something small. A delay. Not in human systems. In the enemy fleet. Just a fraction. A hesitation. He leaned forward. "Pause the replay," he ordered. Nat did. The screen froze on the dreadnought. John zoomed in. "There," he said. Nat followed his gaze. At first, she saw nothing. Then she noticed it too. One of the enemy ships, slightly misaligned. Not damaged. Not destroyed. Just late. "Every jump," John said slowly, "costs them synchronization." Nat's eyes narrowed. "You're saying they're slipping?" "Yes." A new alarm blared. Temporal field instability detected. Enemy formations desynchronizing. Net blinks. "That's new." John nodded. They're pushing their system too hard. Nat turned sharply. To stay ahead of us. To stay ahead of time itself. A pause. Then she whispered. So they're burning their future just to see ours. John didn't answer immediately, because that was exactly what it looked like. Outside the ship, the dreadnought fired again. But this time, something changed. A volley of human missiles actually hit. Not all of them. Not even most. But enough. Explosions flashed across the enemy formation. And for the first time, the dreadnought moved after impact. Nat's eyes widened. It reacted late, she said. John's expression tightened. They're losing precision. The bridge erupted in quiet tension. Hope didn't return. But something else did. Possibility. Nat straightened slightly. If they're slipping, she said, then they're not untouchable. John nodded slowly. But they're still ahead. A pause. Barely, he added. Another flicker on the display. Enemy ships adjusting. Correcting. Overcompensating. Each jump slightly less stable than the last. Nat pointed at the data. Their temporal offset is increasing, she said. Look, each phase shift is wider than before. John studied it. She was right. Every arrival carried more distortion. More instability. Like a machine losing calibration under stress. Nat looked at him. If we keep pressure on them, she said slowly, they might break their own timing system. John didn't respond immediately. Because that was dangerous thinking. Very dangerous. But the data supported it. Outside, Earth's defense grid finally stabilized into a coordinated pattern. Fleets began firing in tighter timing windows. Less randomness. More synchronization. Nat noticed it too. They're adapting to us, she said. John nodded. And we are adapting to them. A beat. Then Nat added quietly. That means we are learning to fight in their time distortion. John finally looked away from the screen. His voice dropped. No, he said. Net Frauenl. What then? He turned slightly. We are learning to force them back into ours. A deep silence followed. Then the dreadnought fired again. But this time, something went wrong. Half the volley missed. Not because of human interference, but because the enemy ships weren't aligned in the same temporal slice anymore. Some were ahead. Some were behind. And some were out of phase entirely. Nat stared at the screen. They're fracturing, she whispered. John nodded once. And now, he said, we just have to keep them breaking. Outside the bridge, space was no longer stable. Time itself had started to crack under the weight of two civilizations refusing to lose. The moment the dreadnought fired, something changed in the entire battle. Not explosions. Not movement. Reality itself stuttered. On every screen, the targeting data flickered for half a second, then corrected itself like it had been wrong all along. Net froze. No, she whispered. John leaned forward. What now? She pointed at the tactical overlay. The shots didn't miss, she said slowly. They arrived where we were going to be after we dodged. A cold silence hit the bridge. That was new. Even for this war. John looked at the incoming trajectories again. She was right. Every human counter move had already been predicted. Not calculated. Not estimated. Already accounted for. As if the enemy wasn't reacting to the battle, but remembering it. Nat's voice dropped. They're not just ahead of us by speed, she said. They're ahead by time. John didn't answer. Because now it was undeniable. The blue flash. The timing error. The impossible dodges. It all pointed to one thing. Temporal displacement. A war where cause and effect no longer stayed in order. The dreadnought fired again. This time, a gravity wave spread outward. It didn't explode ships. It deleted structure cohesion. Armor twisted like wet paper. Stations cracked open without impact. Entire sections of fleet defense simply stopped existing in stable form. And still, the enemy kept advancing. Net klinchel hertjo. If they can see a tenth of a second ahead, she said, then every weapon we fire is already useless before it launches. John stared at the display. His voice was calm. Too calm. Not useless, he said. Nat looked at him sharply. He continued. It still kills them. She frowned. We've hit them, yes. But only when something goes wrong on their end. When they mispredict or overlap. John nodded. That's the gap. Nat didn't like where this was going. What gap? John zoomed in on one of the destroyed enemy ships. It wasn't a clean kill. It was messy. Misaligned. Like the target had almost dodged, but didn't quite complete the movement in time. They're not perfect, John said. Nat hesitated. That's your conclusion? Yes, he said. They see ahead, but they don't control what they see. A new alarm hit the bridge. Secondary enemy formations detected. Orbital spread. Nat turned sharply. More blue flashes. More ships arriving. Layer after layer. Like a wound reopening in space. And every arrival slightly different. Slightly unstable. John watched closely. Then he noticed it. A pattern. Small inconsistencies in arrival timing. Not enough to break their advantage, but enough to exist. They're bleeding time, he said quietly. Nat looked at him. What? John pointed at the data stream. Every jump, he said, costs them something. A delay. A drift. A mismatch. Nat narrowed her eyes. And that means they're not invincible. The dreadnought fired again. This time, Earth's outer defense grid lit up in response. Missiles launched from hidden platforms. Planetary intercept systems activated. Space around the system turned into a web of fire. But again, the enemy moved before impact. Always before impact. Nat slammed her fist lightly against the console. We can't hit what isn't where it should be. John stood up slowly. That's because we are fighting in the wrong order, he said. Nat turned. What does that even mean? John looked at the battle screen. Then at the timestamps. Then at the blue flashes. And finally, he said it. We are fighting forward, he said. They're fighting backward. A long pause. Even Nat didn't speak. Because that sounded insane. But the data agreed. The enemy wasn't just predicting the future. They were acting from a point where the future had already been written. Nat whispered, that's not war, that's editing history. Another impact shook the ship. The dreadnought had reached mid-system now. Pluto station was behind them. Earth was ahead. Nothing remained in between except scattered fleets trying to hold a line that didn't exist anymore. John looked at the evacuation map. Then made a decision. Pull all remaining fleets into defensive clustering, he ordered. Nat blinks. That just makes them easier targets. I know, John said. She stared at him. Then why? Because we are not trying to survive the fight, he interrupted. A pause. We are trying to understand it. Nat didn't like that answer. But she didn't argue. Because outside the ship, the dreadnought stopped firing for the first time. Not retreating. Not hesitating. Observing. Like it was recalculating something. And then Nat saw it too. Her eyes widened slightly. Oh no. John looked at her. What? She pointed at the screen. They've started predicting our counter-predictions, she said. John's expression tightened. The enemy had evolved. Again. And Earth was running out of time, literally. The second alarm never stopped ringing. It just kept repeating like the ship had accepted that panic was now the normal state of reality. On the main screen, the enemy fleet drifted into view. Silent. Perfectly aligned. Too perfect. John stared at it without blinking. The dreadnought at the center was massive, so large it made Pluto Station look like debris stuck to its shadow. And yet, it moved gently. Like it wasn't traveling through space. Like space was moving around it. Nat stepped closer to the tactical display. Her voice dropped. That blue flash again, she said. John nodded slowly. Every ship in that fleet had arrived the same way. Not by normal hyperjump. Not by known drive systems. Something else. Something off-axis. A shift in reality that left a faint blue distortion in space, like heat haze made of light. Status? John asked. Sensors officer swallowed. Distance closing fast. But readings don't match movement. Explain. They're closer than they should be, by about 1/10 of a second. The bridge went quiet. But in combat, it was everything. Nat leaned over the console. 1/10 of a second means they're seeing us before we act, she said. Not reacting. Not calculating. Already knowing. John didn't respond. He was still watching the dreadnought. It had already begun firing. But not at them. At positions they were about to occupy. And those positions were correct. Always correct. The first wave of human counterfire launched. Railguns.
Missiles.
Energy bursts. A wall of destruction aimed straight at the enemy fleet. For a brief moment, hope returned. Then the impossible happened. The enemy ships simply weren't there anymore. Not destroyed. Not dodged. Just absent from where they were supposed to be. And present somewhere else. Exactly where the human fire wasn't aimed yet. Explosions bloomed across empty space behind them. Missiles hit their own predicted future instead of the enemy. Nat whispered, "They're reading firing solutions before we fire." John's jaw tightened. That shouldn't be possible. "It is if they're displaced," she said. A new alert flashed. Defense grid failure. Outer mines bypassed. John turned sharply. "Our minefield." "Gone," the officer replied. "They passed through it without triggering a single system." Silence stretched again. Nat looked at John. "You're thinking it," she said. He didn't deny it. Because he was. The blue flash. The timing errors. The impossible dodging. It all matched one thing. But that answer was supposed to be impossible. Humanity had banned it. Every civilization in known space had agreed on that ban. Even enemies had agreed. Because once time itself becomes a weapon, there is no such thing as war anymore. Only correction. John opened the battle logs again. Replayed the arrival. The flash. Blue. Always blue. He zoomed in. Frame by frame. And there it was. A distortion. Not movement. Not energy. A phase shift. Nat saw it too. Her voice dropped even lower. "No one uses temporal tech," she said. John finished the sentence for her. "Because the last species that did, erased themselves." A tense pause. Then Nat whispered, "Or someone erased them." The bridge felt colder after that. Outside, the enemy dreadnought continued advancing. Slow. Unstoppable. And every shot fired at it arrived slightly too late. Not by distance. By time. 1/10 of a second. Always 1/10. John leaned back slightly in his chair. For the first time, he looked less like a captain and more like someone trying to solve a problem that refused to obey physics. Nat tapped the replay again. "This isn't random," she said. "Look at the pattern." She highlighted multiple destroyed ships. Human ships. Enemy ships. All damage clustered in strange arcs. Not spread. Not chaotic. Controlled. Like someone had already simulated the entire battle, and was just correcting deviations. John finally spoke. "They're not reacting to us," he said quietly. Nat nodded. "They're ahead of us." A heavy silence followed. Then sensors screamed again. Contact shifting. Multiple temporal signatures detected. Nat's eyes widened. "That's not one fleet," she said. John stared at the screen. Dozens more blue flashes. Arriving behind the first wave. Stacked. Layered. Like a memory repeating itself with small changes each time. "They're testing," John said. Nat turned to him. "Testing what?" John didn't answer immediately. Because the answer was already forming in his mind. Testing whether Earth could be erased from time. Cleanly enough that it never fought back. Outside the ship, space bent again. The dreadnought fired. And this time, it wasn't aiming at ships. It was aiming at future trajectories of Earth itself. He felt like he was falling through eternity. Not because the ship was drifting, but because everything around him felt delayed, broken, wrong. Captain John stood on the shattered bridge of the Vanguard, watching his crew try to keep people alive in a room that had stopped caring about comfort or safety. The evacuation order had gone out minutes ago. The worst wounded were already gone. What was left was damage, smoke, and silence pretending to be order. Outside the armored hull, space itself was still full of death. The battle near Pluto Station had been too fast for the human mind to fully accept. Enemy warships had arrived like ghosts. No warning. No build-up. Just a flash, and then war. And in that first instant, thousands had died. Missiles had launched. Railguns had fired. Defense grids had screamed into action. But the enemy moved like they were always one step ahead. Not faster. Not stronger. Just already there. A fraction of a second ahead of reality. Behind him, something burst open in the wall. A short hiss. Then the sharp smell of burned insulation filled the bridge. Fire contained. Someone shouted from engineering. The lights flickered once, twice, then stabilized. For a moment, everything looked normal again. That was the worst part. Normal didn't belong here anymore. Engineering, report, John said calmly. A voice came through the broken comm system. Fusion Core 2 is stable again, Captain. We are back to fighting condition. There was a pause. Then the engineer added quietly, barely. Good work, John replied. Secure systems. Prepare for evacuation. We are out of this fight. A sharp silence followed. Everyone heard the order. No one liked it. But no one argued. Most senior officers were already dead or injured. The rest were scattered across emergency stations, keeping the ship from falling apart in real time. A medic knelt beside a comms officer, wrapping a head wound. Someone else was manually cutting a jammed cable, sealing sparks before they turned into another fire. The Vanguard was still alive. But just barely. Status on Pluto Station. John asked. A young comms officer responded quickly. Pluto Station is an emergency lockdown, sir. Shipyards are heavily damaged, but core structures are holding. They're taking survivors from the fleet. She hesitated. Enemy dreadnought only fired once on the station. That caught his attention. Only once. Yes, sir. John frowned slightly. Interesting. A fleet that powerful, and they didn't finish the job? Understood, he said. Focus on support. Keep damage control teams alive. Yes, sir. She turned back to her console immediately. John watched her for a moment longer than necessary. She wasn't trained for this level of command. But she had stepped into it anyway.
No hesitation. No breakdown.
Just action. That mattered. Behind him, his executive officer, Nat, leaned against a broken console while a medic worked on her head wound. She pushed the medic's hand away once she could stand. I'm fine, she muttered. You're not fine, the medic replied. I've been worse. She walked over to John. I was slightly unfocused. But her voice was steady. We are still breathing, she said. That's more than most of the fleet. John didn't answer immediately. He looked at the tactical display. What remained of their fleet was scattered like broken glass across space. Some ships were gone completely. Some were drifting dead. Some were still firing, but blind. Nat continued. The hull is twisted. Armor is compromised. Energy rails are bent beyond calibration. She tapped the console. Missile tubes are crushed. We can't launch properly. A tired pause. Then, almost casually. We could probably force missiles out by brute pressure, but I don't recommend it. A faint smirk crossed John's face. And the guns? Kinetic cannons still work. Barely. But if the barrels point the right way, they'll fire. Then we still have teeth, John said. Old, cracked teeth, Nat replied. But yes. A low vibration passed through the ship. Another impact somewhere far below. The Vanguard shuddered but held. Nat leaned closer to the tactical feed. There's something else, she said. John looked at her. Her tone changed slightly. Not fear. Not panic. Something more dangerous. Confusion. That dreadnought, she said. It's wrong. Wrong how? We tracked the firing patterns. Every time we shot, it reacted before the shot even existed. John narrowed his eyes. That's impossible. I know, she said. But look. She replayed a segment of combat footage. Ships firing. Rounds leaving barrels. And enemy ships already shifting position before impact was even calculated. Not reacting. Not dodging. Avoiding something that hadn't happened yet. John watched it carefully. Once. Twice. Then he went still. At the edge of the recording, a flash. Blue. Not white like normal hyperjump signatures. Blue. Nat saw his expression change. You see it too, she said quietly. John didn't answer right away. Because deep down, something in his mind had already started forming a conclusion he didn't want to accept. If they weren't reacting to fire, if they weren't predicting movement, then they weren't in normal time at all. And that meant the battle near Pluto Station was never really a fair fight. It was something else. Something worse. John slowly exhaled. Get me the full arrival logs, he said. Net nodded. But before she moved, the ship shook again, harder this time. A warning flashed across the bridge. Incoming hostile signature detected. John looked up at the main screen. Another fleet signature. Closer than before. Much closer. And still moving like it had already arrived. Nat whispered one line that made the entire bridge go cold. They're not chasing us, John. A pause. They're already ahead of us.